Hello, attendees, and hello, Laura. Welcome back to our webinar today, Rethinking Compliance and Enforcement for Modern ESPs. We haven't done the webinars for a while now, but today we are back with Laura Atkins, as you can see. She has been part of the email industry, I think, for almost 20 years now, and we're super excited that she found the time to share her experience with you and with us today. Shortly to my person, my name is Maike and I'm responsible for the marketing and events at the Certified Senders Alliance. And maybe some attendees may ask, who's the Certified Senders Alliance? Our goal is to increase the quality of commercial emailing. In addition to our CSA certification for ESPs and brands, we offer, for example, our new tool, the CSA Certification Monitor, that we have, for example, a webinar in 2 weeks with all the information about the CSA certification monitor and our review of the year. Maybe you would also like to attend. And yeah, if you have any questions about the CSA, just come back to us after the webinar and we will get further information for you or send you further information. But let's go back to the webinar today. The housekeeping rules for today. Please note that you're muted during the whole webinar, but you have two options today to ask your questions. The first option is you can raise your hand and ask your question live at the end of the session. And the second one is that you can use the chat function. It might be on the right on your screen and submit your questions during the webinar and I can read them out loud at the end of the session. It's up to you how you want to ask your questions. Of course, we would be happy if you use the function raise your hand so we can have a discussion at the end of the webinar with Laura. And Laura, are you there?
I am here, yes.
Perfect.
Hello.
Hello. So yeah, now I can see you. That's good. I just need to switch my screen to Laura, and then I think you can start. Just one note, I think she will start with a poll, and you see the results at the end. So yeah, as I mentioned, all questions you can ask during the webinar. I will collect them, and if you have any questions, just feel free to ask, and you will hear me and see me at the end of the session. And now I just need to switch the moderation rights. Oop. Yes. I think now you just need to accept and then you can start. Perfect.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you and to the CSA about rethinking compliance and enforcement for modern ESPs. This is actually something I've been thinking about for quite a while now and kind of thinking about how what we're doing isn't quite working. So having this opportunity has been awesome. Who am I? I'm Laura Atkins. I co-founded Word to the Wise back in 2001. Prior to that, I was actually at MAPS, who are now part of Trend Micro, and ran one of the first commercial block lists. And I'm mostly known as a deliverability person, and so I help people get their mail delivered. What a lot of folks don't know is that, on the side, I actually do a lot of compliance, and I work with a lot of ESPs and a lot of SaaS providers and people who have email as part of their platform to figure out how to keep their platforms clean. And so, I have a lot of thoughts about how we do this, and I have a lot of thoughts about how we do it well and how we don't do it well. So before I dive in today, we're going to get into our poll. And the poll question here is, what is the primary metric your compliance desk uses to identify problem customers? And I have a couple ideas up here. I think there's a couple fewer on the actual poll that's going to be sent over to you. So if you can just go ahead and tell me what you think, what's the primary metric you use? And we'll come back to this in a couple minutes and then we'll talk about the results. And there's the poll. So we'll give everybody a few minutes. While you guys are taking the poll, I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about compliance desks, why we have compliance desks, where they came from, what did we do, what's the whole idea behind them, and how did they evolve. And then we're going to talk about the measurements and the monitoring that we do as part of the compliance desk in order to think about what these metrics are and what these metrics are telling us. Then we're going to talk about how do we make those measurements work better for us? You know, what are the flaws in the measurements and how do we make them better? And then we're going to talk a little bit, then we're going to have some questions and some discussion and hopefully have some back and forth and hear your side and what you think of the stuff that I have talked about today. So compliance. As I said, I started off at MAPS, and actually MAPS tried to hire me multiple times when they were first getting started back in 2000, and they kept trying to hire me on the block list side, and I was like, I don't really want to do the block list stuff. You know, I understand block lists are important and blocking mail is important, and we want to do all of this, but that's the stick end of the picture. You know, that's the stick end of fighting spam. I want to be on the carrot end. I want to give folks the answers that make it easier for them to do mail the right way and to use email the right way rather than just blocking it. So I want to be the carrot end of the equation. And that has actually carried through in a lot of what I've been doing over time and a lot of what I've done since then. And since I left MAPS and founded Word to the Wise, I'm all about the stick. Let's make it easy. Make the right thing easy. But where did compliance desks come from in the first place? Why are we here? Why do we even have to do this? And it all goes back to filters. The ISPs, particularly very early on in the late 90s and the very early 2000s, they had one thing they could do. They had one way they could block mail, and that was IP-based filters. ESPs were just getting started. We were really new as an entire, product in an entire industry. ESPs were new, ISPs were reasonably new. And so a lot of ESPs started off by having customers just on shared pools and sending out lots of email. And they'd get a bad customer on, and the customer would go and send spam. And then the ISP, using the only technique it had, would block that IP address, and then customers wouldn't get their mail, and it would all be horrible, and everybody would send complaints. The end users, they'd complain to the sender, and they'd complain to the ISP, and the senders would complain to the ESPs, and the ESPs would complain to the ISPs, and it was just, everybody was angry at each other because mail wasn't getting through. And in some cases, the mail wasn't getting through for reasonable reasons. You know, it was actually spam and it actually should be blocked. But in other cases, the mail was just collateral damage because we were coming off of shared IPs. And the ISPs, the only way they had to stop spam was that IP-based block. And so they would block innocent customers. And so early on, there was a lot of kind of engagement between the ESPs and the ISPs and the senders. And I think the first meeting I had with a bunch of ESPs and a bunch of ISPs was actually back in like 2002, sitting in the habeas offices, where we were kind of talking, how do we solve this problem? How do we come up with things? What kinds of things can we do to make email work better and to serve our customer base, you know, to serve our recipients and to serve our users? And so over the next few years, and through about 2012 even, there were a lot of adaptations and a lot of compensations that happened. The ISPs, they published Postmaster pages and they set up feedback loops, and they set up agreements with certification and reputation services so that senders could get certified and senders could have this authority and have this stamp of approval from an outside third party, so that the ISPs could make better decisions and the ISPs could make easier decisions, and the ISPs didn't have to get that giant sledgehammer of a block, of an IP-based block, that they could do other things. Meanwhile, the ISPs were also upgrading and updating and improving their filters so that they didn't have to, rely on that IP-based block. On the ESP side, we set up compliance desks. We actually started to figure out what we needed to do to stop our customers from sending mail and sending spam and from doing bad things. Part of that was consuming and acting on feedback loops and enforcing AUPs, but part of that was also segregating customers. So, I don't know how many of you have been around for a really long time, but we used to have good pools and bad pools, and then we had dedicated IPs, and so we were trying to separate out customers so that our really good customers would never suffer the consequences of our really bad customers. And we could do all of these things, again, to mitigate the bad mail from affecting our good mail. So we get to a state where there's a little bit of improved filtering. You know, the ISPs, they still have their IP-based filters, but now they have safe lists. Now they have feedback loops. Now we have certification. They start to mix in as well some domain-based reputation. Along the lines, we invented SPF and we invented DKIM, and now we've invented DMARC. And all of these things really allow the ISPs to have something other than an IP address to hang a reputation on, so that they can selectively block mail, and they can much more selectively block mail. And that makes users happy, and that makes that makes senders happy, because we can now manage our outgoing mail in a way that our good customers get through and our bad customers kind of suffer their own consequences. But the takeaway is that compliance really evolved out of a necessity to preserve deliverability in a shared IP environment, so that we could, as senders, and we could, as that first line of defense against spam on the internet, and to protect our own networks as the ESP, and to protect our own infrastructure, we could do all of these things to manage our customer base so that blocks didn't happen. And we didn't have to, because of one bad customer sneaking on, one stolen credit card, one compromised account, that we didn't have to deal with thousands of customers upset because their mail wasn't getting in. And that's really the crux of where compliance came from, is we were about stopping spam, we were about protecting our networks, and we were about facilitating good mail getting out there. So how did we do that? That brings us to part 2 of our talk. What do we monitor? How do we monitor it? And what does it tell us? So, and this is where we get the results of the polls. Can we see the results? So, yep, primary metrics that folks use are complaints. We look at blocks. Some folks are using ISP tools, not very many, and I agree with that. There are a few others, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more of the others. But I think, you know, everybody's using a lot of the same stuff. It's complaints, bounces, and blocks. But what do they really tell us? So if we could go back to slides, cool. So what are our standard metrics? We have raw complaints, we have complaint rates, we've got what's on a block list, domain or IP based, bounces. Some people use opens. I know there's a couple larger ESPs that actually track opens as part of their compliance metrics. There's ISP tools, Google Postmaster and SNDS, and then there's some commercial monitoring that we have access to. So I come from science, and I always start off with, let's define our terms. And so I like to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page, and that when I say complaints, we all understand what I'm talking about. And in this case, what I'm talking about is we have users that have access to a "this is spam" button, and they smash that "this is spam" button because they've decided they don't like this mail, or whatever reason they've decided they're going to smash it. That gives it information to the ISP, and then the ISP takes that, packages it up in a very standard format, and sends it off to the ESP. And then we, at the ESP, we do a little bit of math, and we say, well, you know, if our customers are generating less than 0.1% complaints, then everything is fine. And I actually had an occasion, somebody asked me just a couple weeks ago about where does this 0.1% come from? And it actually comes a very long time ago when AOL first started to do the feedback loops. They said, you've got to keep your complaint, you've got to have less than 1,000 complaints in a million, you know, 0.1% complaints. Otherwise, you're at risk of being blocked. So that's kind of where we got the 0.1% from, and we kind of just stuck on that and ran with it. But in order for our complaint rates to be accurate, and in order for that information to be correct, and that information to be used correctly, there are things that have to happen, and there are things that have to happen and things that have to be true all along the process. So in order for a user to actually be able to generate a feedback loop complaint, that email must be in the inbox. There is no "this is spam" button in the spam folder. And that, you know, is meaningful. We need to be aware that if one of our customers' mail is all going into the spam folder, well, we're not going to get any complaints about it. They also have to use the correct mail client. And this, I think, is not as well understood and is not as well known in a lot of spaces. But, you know, when you're dealing with Microsoft or when you're dealing with AOL, because you're in a webmail client or because you're in a client owned by Microsoft or because you're in a client owned by Yahoo or because you're in a client owned by Gmail, they can wire a whole bunch of stuff into that "this is spam" button. And so they can wire it into their own reputation. They can wire it into just put this mail in the spam folder. They can do all sorts of automation, and part of that automation is and trigger a feedback loop. But if I am, for instance, using Outlook, or I'm an Apple Mail user, or I'm using Thunderbird, or I'm using some other mail client, that "this is spam" button is not wired into the feedback loop. So anybody who's, you know, at Yahoo and is using mail.app or is using the Apple Mail client on the phone, they may hit the "this is spam" button, but that doesn't actually trigger or generate a feedback loop complaint because there's no pathway to get that information from the mail client back to the user. So users have to be in the mail client that's actually owned by the company sending the feedback loop. And then the complaints have to be from a consumer mailbox. If you are on a paid Google Workspace, if you are on a paid Office 365, and it doesn't matter whether you're a company or you're just an individual with a very small domain that has decided they're going to outsource their email to these providers, no feedback loops are generated except from the consumer mailboxes. And this is true, I believe, for every company that's sending feedback loops. They do not send feedback loops for business and for paid users. It's only for the free users. So that's what has to be happening, and that's what has to happen and be true for the user. On the ISP end, well, the ISP must actually provide an email feedback loop. And there's only a couple dozen ISPs in the world that actually do provide an email feedback loop. So we're already at a position where not everybody can provide or get or generate a feedback loop. Only certain companies have feedback loops. And then the ISP must actually send all those messages back. And this is, I think, one of those struggles, is that a lot of people, I think, believe that every time that "this is spam" button is hit, that they get a complaint, and that's not true. Microsoft just recently, it was in the last 6 months, made a comment over on the mail op list, one of the Microsoft representatives, that Microsoft was only sending about 1 in 1,000 feedback loop complaints to users. Now, personally, I do believe that they're not sending all of them. I don't believe that it's that small a ratio. I think the ratio is different, but I have no proof. But after that was said, we actually, a bunch of folks started reporting that they saw kind of this spike in Microsoft feedback loop complaints. So we think there's something going on there, and we're not sure what it is, but it does look like they're actually sending back more of the feedback loops than they used to. Yahoo as well in the past has said that they don't send back all of the feedback loops, that they only send back some of them. They don't send all of them. I've heard contradictory stuff from different Yahoo reps over the last, again, about 6 months, where we've been talking about this with them. But I don't think we can as an industry assume that we're getting all of the feedback loops that are generated in the mail clients. And then on the ESP, we must consume and we must act on the feedback loops. So in order for complaints to be accurate, all of these things have to be true. And even if all of these things are true, it doesn't always tell us the full story, right? The mail that's in the spam folder can't be reported to spam. If mail is accepted and then thrown away, which we know Microsoft does, that can't be reported as spam. If mail is blocked, that can't be reported as spam. Now, some of our other metrics may pick up these issues, but we won't get a feedback loop complaint about them. And then there's the issue of Gmail, who doesn't send feedback loops at all. They just send us over to the Google Postmaster tools and say, go take a number from there. Users not on webmail clients can't report spam. Complaint rates can be manipulated, and they are manipulated. And we know that kind of these senders that are on the edge, and in fact, some bad senders, what they'll often do is they'll, acquire a list, however they acquire the list, whether it's legally or not, or they'll buy it or whatever. And they'll move through many different ESPs, and they'll basically clean the list through every ESP, and they'll just remove addresses that don't complain. So by the time they get to the really good ESPs, and by the time they get to the high value, really good reputation, have a good compliance desk, they've cleaned that list so much that they might not get any complaints at all because they've removed everybody who would complain. And so there's entire industries out there about how to clean complainers off your list. And in fact, the list hygiene industry also says that they can remove screamers and complainers. And then there's the whole problem with business domains, which means that for companies for ESPs that are focused on those B2B companies and focused on B2B senders, you cannot focus on complaints because you'll get almost none because nobody sends feedback loop complaints for business domains. So this is the kind of thing that we're going to talk about through this entire discussion is we have these metrics and we make assumptions about what these metrics are telling us, but sometimes those metrics are wrong and they don't tell the whole story. And then part 2 of this is going to be, and here's how we can fix it, and here's how we can make better assumptions, and here's how we can use the data better in order to get a bigger picture and get more of the story. A bunch of you said that you use bounces. Fair enough. And when we're talking about bounces, we're generally talking about, mail that's been blocked or mail that's not getting through or mail that's been rejected. There's hard bounces and there's soft bounces. And one of these days I'm going to hold an entire one day, we're going to sit in a scrum and we're going to discuss what a bounce actually is and what a hard bounce means and what a soft bounce means, because everybody uses that terminology different. But we use bounces. We can't send this mail. So what do? How do we fix that? And we count them up. And we use that as a metric for our clients are doing something bad. But again, they don't tell us the whole story. And in fact, there's an entire industry that has popped up around list hygiene where they will remove bouncing addresses from lists. And as ESPs, that just makes our lives so much more difficult. As compliance people, not being able to have that data and having somebody else just clean off all that data. And so our client brings us a list and there's no bounces or there's very few bounces and it looks clean from our metrics, and yet it doesn't perform well, or yet it goes to the spam folder. And all of that is about, well, these list hygiene services are actually removing valuable data that help us as compliance deal with the mail and deal with our customers. And much the way that some of the more marginal senders out there use bounces or clean complaints off a list, they do the same thing with bounces. They will run lists, they'll buy a list and they'll run it through different ESPs and they'll clean addresses off as they go. And then again, once they get up to those good ESPs with those good compliance desks, the lists look clean from the outside. They're not. They don't have permission. They don't have any of this, nobody asked to receive this mail. It's still spam, but it doesn't look like spam because there's all of this challenge, this cleaning going on. And then there's the classification of bounces, and I can't tell you the number of times I have started let's write the definitive how to do bounces, and I get about 3/4 of the way into the outline and go, my brain has just exploded because this is hard. This is not easy. And I blame the ISPs for a lot of that because they reject mail with the codes and the things that make sense to them, and it's not consistent across ESPs or across ISPs, and it's very confusing. So bounds classification is challenging, and when we don't classify them well, we don't understand very well what that data is telling us. Another thing folks use, I don't think this was actually very high up the list in the poll, but people use public block lists. You know, they will look up, and this is actually very true when people first come in, when you're screening a new customer, when you're onboarding a new customer, they'll look for IP addresses and domains on public block lists and see, is this a bad sender? Is this sender listed? Is this going to be a problem? Can we actually, you know, take them on as a customer? But block lists don't tell the whole story. A lot of them more widely used block lists, and let's be honest, and let's kind of just say it out here. What I'm really talking about is Spamhaus, because they're one of the more widely used block lists. They rely on spam traps and sentinel addresses, and you can modify that data. You can remove the information without even knowing what the spam traps are. Without even knowing what their sentinel addresses are, you can clean lists by focusing on openers. You know, you can clean lists by looking at your address collection processes and just getting rid of entire swathes of the lists where the address collection might be unclear. So you can clean lists and make it such that even bad lists are not listed. Some of the block lists rely on manual intervention. So they have all of this data coming in, and, you know, Spamhaus has told me that they've got tens of thousands of emails coming in per second to some of their spam traps. They just have huge volumes of mail coming in. And when you have that volume, all you can do is do statistical analysis and see what bubbles to the top. And a lot of times the mail that we're sending, the mail that's coming out of ESPs, the mail that is most likely to be at least partially filtered by the ESP who's doing the right thing, it doesn't bubble to the top. So, you know, I've certainly talked with clients who are, in my opinion, probably deserve to be on Spamhaus. And in fact, you know, if I go talk to Spamhaus, they'll tell me, yeah, well, but they're just not bad enough. And so by relying on this data, we're kind of missing the picture because Spamhaus is off dealing with so many other things. And then there's the block lists are unreliable. And this is kind of the flip side of that, where our clients and our customers will go to a website and they'll put in their IP or they'll put in their domain name and they'll look, and it'll come up with these 14 different obscure block lists that don't do anything and nobody pays attention to them. They block mail for like 2 guys and their dog. So they're unreliable. And so it's hard to kind of figure out which ones we should pay attention to and which ones we shouldn't, and all of this. And sometimes, again, sometimes our customers will be on those lists that are more aggressive and not be on the lists that are more conservative. But it's hard to tell which ones are just accidental or bad listings and which ones are really there. So just being on a public block list doesn't tell the whole story. Opens. We use opens. And I know there are a couple ESPs out there that actually really rely on opens. But what is an open? What really happens when we say the mail was open, we have an open? And what it is just to make sure that we're all on the same page. When somebody sends an email, they can put in a pixel or they can put in an image that is tagged with the email address that image was sent to. And so they send individual images to every email address. And how an open is recorded is somebody follows a link, loads an image, and that pings a web server somewhere. And basically on the back end, somebody looks at that web server and says, oh, we got a ping from this email address, and we got a ping from this email address. So an open isn't somebody actually opened and is looking at the mail on their mail client. An open is somebody loaded an image hosted on a web server that I have access to the logs to. And that is the crux of why opens are a problem. Image loading doesn't, image loading doesn't mean that a person read the mail. This has been an ongoing and increasing problem over about the last 5 years, as a lot of spam filters and a lot of the lot of the business filters have been starting to regularly follow all the links in a mail. We also know that some of the ISPs prefetch images. We know Yahoo has said that they do it. They have been very clear that they do it. The new Apple Mail privacy protection is now prefetching images for users of iOS 15 and Monterey. Now, I will tell you that I upgraded to Monterey just recently, and it did not prompt me to do it on Monterey and prompt me to turn on privacy protection. It accepted that I have images shut off in my mail client, and it was just like, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. But that is the problems. You can have images loaded without the person actually opening the mail. And in fact, I was troubleshooting with an ESP client of mine who was seeing opens before the mail was delivered. And what we finally figured out was that there was a particular filter out there that was soft failing the mail. So they were basically, they tried to deliver the mail. The filter said, look, took a copy of the mail and then said, no, come back in a little while. We're just going to temp fail this now, come back and try again. While the message was sitting in the ESP's queue, the filter was actually following all the links and doing all of its research on the back end. So the second time it was attempted to be delivered, it was accepted and then went to the user's inbox. But what my client saw was images were being loaded before the mail was delivered. And so that's how bad and how problematic image loading is as a metric of somebody read the mail, because it's really not. And there's also, again, the flip side of that is that image loading doesn't mean the mail was unread. I said, I have image loading turned off on my mail client. I have for a very long time. That doesn't mean I don't read mail, and that doesn't mean that I'm actually unengaged. There's a couple newsletters that I know I get every Friday. There's a couple newsletters that I know I get every Monday, and I read them. Sometimes I even click through on them, but I don't load the images. So when we're looking at opens, we can't trust that they mean necessarily that the mail was read. And finally, we have ISP tools. And this is just a couple screenshots. We've all seen these before. It's Google Spam Rate, it's an SNDS page. And I find them challenging, particularly Microsoft with SNDS. The colors, you have the colors of the reds and the greens and the yellows, and everybody assumes that the colors are about the IP address, and the colors are actually the smart screen filter, which is more of a content filter. And that's based on user reaction and interaction, and it's all kind of a mess. So I don't know, and this is anybody who actually uses these tools and pulls information out of them, good on you, because I generally struggle with trying to figure out what they're telling me. Google Postmaster tools, sometimes it's going to be difficult for ESPs to actually identify which customers are the problem. I know that some people have problems getting Google to report the feedback loop identifier, so they just see a spike in complaints and they don't know which customer caused it. There's also the problem if we're looking at reputation, or if we're looking at IP reputation or things like that. It can be a lagging indicator. I've seen a 2 to 3 week delay between, we'll start to see delivery problems, but the reputation will still be high. And by the time, the reputation goes to low or medium, we've been having delivery problems for a month now. Likewise, if we're trying to fix something, it can take 2 to 3 weeks for the fixes to reflect in the Google Postmaster tools. So it's all, again, all of the data that we have all of the metrics that we use have limitations and they don't tell us the whole story. And in some respects, that's why we use so many different metrics, because we're trying to say we know that we're going to miss stuff. And the idea is that if we use enough metrics, maybe one of them will tell us what the problem is. And maybe one of them will give us a hint that there is a problem. And so we can go ahead and we can look at it and we can identify whether or not we can fix things. So as compliance professionals, we need to modernize our metric to be able to identify clients who are sending spam in contravention to our AUP. And we need to get better at being able to flexibly look at this data to be able to find what's going on. So I'm going to touch on a couple basic ways that I can think of, and these are not, I can go down this rat hole. I could do, a half-day training course on let's improve metrics. But I'm just going to talk about a couple ways that I've recommended to clients over the years and that things that have worked to help identify some problem customers that we might have otherwise missed. But what I really hope that you take away from this is that you need to think about your own metrics. You need to think about what it is that you're doing internally and how you can identify and update your metrics in your situation to be able to better find those problem customers. So let's talk about complaint rates. And this is just kind of a recap of what I was talking about before with complaint rates, and that it's the number of feedback loop complaints divided by the number of emails sent. And there are problems with this, and we don't always get the right data. But we can hack the complaint rates. And this is a visual, just kind of representation of a generic Gmail list or a generic consumer mail list that has about 38% of the list at AOL, Yahoo, Microsoft, and some other domains that provide feedback loops. It has about 40% of the list at Google, which is about what I see in my clients. For certainly my consumer clients, having 40 or 50 or even 60% Gmail addresses is pretty normal. And then we have 22% of the mail goes to all of those other domains that don't actually have a feedback loop. And on the right-hand side, what we have is a representation of just those recipients that have access to a feedback loop. That if they hit the "this is spam" button, those recipients will trigger an email, those recipients will trigger a metric to come back to us as the ISP, as the ESP, and give us data that we can work with. So how can we hack the complaint rates? Well, the really easy way to hack the complaint rates is to just remove all of the recipients that don't get mail at a domain with an ISP. So if we have 1 million recipients on our list, we need 1,000 complaints to give us that 0.1% complaint rate. But we need 3 times that amount of complaints, just that percentage of complaints from the folks with the feedback loop in order to get that 1,000. So we're in a position where we need to actually have really, really bad customers to be able to reach that 1% complaint threshold, or 0.1% complaint threshold, because we've so much diluted it out with people that don't have access to a feedback loop. If we look at a list with even more Gmail recipients, and I use 66% because that's another one, although I have a client that has, I think it's 92% Gmail addresses. They're some big consumer thing, and they have all Gmail addresses. And so the more Gmail addresses you have, the higher the number of complaints that you need from the folks with feedback loop domains in order to be able to hit that threshold where all of a sudden you're going, oh, maybe this client has a problem. Maybe this customer is doing something wrong. In an ideal world, we would calculate complaints as the number of complaints from domains with a feedback loop. And in a really ideal world, it would be domains with a feedback loop where the mail got to the inbox, and divide that by the number of emails sent to domains with a feedback loop. This gets into a rat hole of, well, what domains are going to places with a feedback loop, and Do we get feedback loop emails from AT&T because it's handled by Yahoo? And do we get feedback loops from all of this and SBC Global? And how many domains does Yahoo actually manage mail for? And it gets into this really kind of soupy mess of, well, now we have to do a lot of math and we have to do a lot of DNS work and we have to maintain all of this stuff, and it gets complicated. And that's not what we want. We're looking for something that's going to tell us quickly where our customers have problems so that we can focus the resources on stopping them from being spammers and stopping them from doing bad things. So this is my easy hack, and just take away Gmail. If you have a consumer list and you want to normalize your complaint rates, just remove that number of Gmail recipients from your number of emails sent. And we get to a place where instead of needing 1,000 complaints to get to a 0.1% complaint rate, and that 1,000 complaints is coming from 3,400 or 340,000 recipients, now we only need 340 complaints to get to that 0.1% complaint rate. And so it's easier for us to identify those customers that are generating a lot of complaints, because we're not trying to compare apples and oranges. We're comparing complaints from people who have access to a feedback loop and complaints to people who have access to a feedback loop. So that's the Gmail hack. And it does work, and it does actually can help you identify easier which customers might be having a problem. And again, it's not that, okay, they hit a 0.1% complaint rate, now we need to get rid of them. It's more along the lines of, they hit a 0.1% complaint rate, we might need to look harder at them. We might need to pay a little bit more attention. We may need to keep an eye on them and see, is this a one-time thing, or does it change? Does it get worse? What's going on here? Is our customer violating our AUP? There's another thing we can do with Gmail as well. So we've now removed all of those users, and we have Google Postmaster tools, and they'll give us 0.1, 0.2%. I kind of like a little bit more accuracy in my complaint rates than Gmail is willing to give me. Now, certainly if there's a giant spike, it's easy to see, but it's hard to sometimes catch subtle changes in their particular interface. And when I'm looking for clients with a problem, sometimes I want to see those subtle changes. But Google uses the list unsubscribe header to provide users with the ability to say, unsubscribe and report spam versus just reporting spam. So if we track our list unsubscribe header separately from the unsubscribe link in our footer, we can make some assumptions and we can make some estimations that at least some percentage, and maybe it's 10 and maybe it's 20, but at least some percentage of the people who have now hit the list unsubscribe in the Gmail interface, that they actually intended to complain as spam. And so we can track that, the list unsubscribe, as a way of tracking, well, maybe, complaints are up. And we can use it kind of as a proxy for complaints at Google, track that, and again, see what users we might need to take a closer look at. For bounces, a lot of people said they used bounces for tracking when email was, or when users were doing bad things. And I kind of interpreted that as, we're going to use hard bounces and those, user unknowns, and what does your list quality look like? But the ISPs these days are actually really good. The machine learning filters are very, very good at identifying and blocking specific mails in a mixed environment. So it's been a decade now where I had a client that was sending mail off a return path certified IP address. That IP address sent both newsletters and a daily comic. So it was it was daily comic, it was newsletters. They also had a marketing stream where they were actually selling, sending ads to that same recipient list. Yahoo was really good. Yahoo would put all the comics and all the newsletters in the inbox, and they'd put all the marketing mail in the spam folder. And this was a certified IP. Everything was identical, and this was 10 years ago. And so we also get the point where the ISPs start blocking mail, even temp failing or rate limiting for reputation reasons at the edge. even in a shared IP environment, even in a mixed environment, even when it's all the same sender and they selectively bounce out mail. And so we can actually use that and we can monitor our logs and we can say, oh, hey, this particular customer is getting a lot of temp fails at Microsoft, or they're getting a lot of temp fails with TSS04 at Yahoo. And so the ISPs are telling us there's something wrong here. We can use that as a way to identify customers that we should go take another look at, and we should look more closely at, because the ISP is telling us, hey, we don't want this mail, and we'll happily accept all this other mail from this IP address, and we'll happily accept all of this other message, even from the same domain. But this particular mail stream, no, you can't send us that much mail from this mail stream. That's your sign. And those are the kinds of things that we can look at. And these are the small changes that we can make in monitoring to help us identify those problem customers and then go out and deal with them through whatever process is appropriate inside our own system and inside our own network. So I'm going to run real quick through B2B monitoring because I think it's worth talking about, but I want to get to some questions, and I am running a little out of time. So in the B2B space, it's much like what we're doing at the consumer end. Is we're taking advantage of those B2B filters. So the Proofpoints and the Ciscos and the Barracudas and the Sophos and all of those companies, they will put mail in the spam folder, or they will temp fail mail, or they will block mail. And when that happens, what I hear a lot of people ask is, well, how do I fix that? And I think instead what should be asked is, what did my client do wrong? And unfortunately, in the compliance space, that's where we need to start, is what did the client do to cause this? Because these filters don't come up just accidentally, and they don't come up for no reason. There's a reason, and so we need to figure out what that reason is. In the B2B space, the other big piece is there are no complaints. There are no complaint feedback loops. Microsoft and Gmail both have business mail and consumer mail going in through the same filters, and they have them on the same interface, but they do not return emails for complaints. Anything you see in Google Postmaster tools is only the gmail.com. Anything you get from the JMRP from Microsoft is from the Microsoft consumer free domains, not from the paid domains. And so we can't use complaint rate to identify problem customers in this space. We have to be able to look at and read individual complaints. And, you know, there was just recently, I contacted a colleague who's at a fairly big ESP, and I said, hey, I've been complaining about this particular customer of yours who's been spamming me for a month now. And, you know, they bought my address and they scraped it off the website, and they're spamming, and you guys haven't even like gone so far as to like block them from being able to mail me. What's up? And the answer I got back was, oh, well, their feedback loop complaint rate isn't high enough to trigger us to investigate. And it's like, but they're never going to trigger that because you don't get feedback loops for business domains. You just don't. And so we need to have a way, particularly if you are an ESP that is focused on the B2B space, you need to have a way to look at individual complaints and read those individual complaints. So actually, well, my slides are out of order. So B2B compliance, you must value the data quality over the data quantity. Our key takeaways, and the really kind of things that I want you to think about and that I hope that you get out of this talk, is that, you know, our role as compliance is to protect the network for and to protect the network from our customers. And so we have kind of this place of, we are the frontline defense in anti-spam. We are anti-spammers, and it's our job to make sure that our customers are doing things that are not going to harm the network and are not going to harm our companies. That's what the companies pay us for. our metrics need to be flexible and they need to change as the filtering changes. I think a lot of places that I've talked to and a lot of companies that I've talked to over the years, they're still kind of focused on it's all about the IP. It's all about the IP. Well, no, our Sunder score is 99. I have a slide from 15 years ago that has our Sunder score is 99. Why is our mail all failing? You know, just because your Sunder score is 99 doesn't mean that you're not sending spam. It means that you're sending possibly mail that Sunder score can't see and they're not getting the data from or whatever it is. But we can't just focus on the IP addresses. We need to be able to understand what's going on in the filtering space so that our metrics can keep up and we can continue to identify those customers that have problems. We need to be creative in how we use and interpret our data, and we can't just do, simple math. We might need to do a couple hacks of, well, just pull out all the Gmail data. But even small changes work, and even small changes can improve our ability to identify problem customers and can improve the compliance and can find those folks that are kind of sneaking in under the radar and maybe, they're doing stuff that's okay or not okay. But we want to know a little bit more about our customer so that we can go ahead and we can say, this is what you're doing is fine, or what you're not doing is fine. So thank you all. We do have time for questions. We've got a few minutes. So I am more than happy to talk to folks and answer them.
Yes. Hello. Hello again. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. I think I will read them out loud and
Okay.
start with the first one. Do you think it should be mandatory for an ISP to have a feedback loop if they are going to use complaints in their reputation scoring?
So I think it should be mandatory. No. Well, I mean, yes, they should. But I've not yet found a way to force an ISP to do anything. And certainly part of, I have similar discussions with ISPs where I tell them they're doing things wrong. But they're going to do what's right for their network. And providing a feedback loop and managing a feedback loop, and this is not a no-cost thing. And in fact, we had kind of this explosion between about 2007 and 2012. There was about 5 years there where there was this explosion of feedback loops, and a lot of companies were doing feedback loops. What was going on behind the scenes was there was actually a company that was absorbing a lot of the cost of putting together those feedback loops. They were absorbing the cost of managing the feedback loop. They were absorbing the cost of authorizing people to identifying who could get the feedback loop and where the right place to go. And so there was a company that was taking on a lot of the costs associated with the feedback loop for the ISPs in return for them getting data from the ISPs about the mail. But it was not, it's expensive, and it costs the ISP money for very little because we are not paying for this data. We're being given this data. And so it's hard to convince the ISPs that they have to, and they're required to, and they should be forced to spend this money so that we can get the data that we want. And that's one of the challenges here, is that a lot of the data that we rely on as ESPs, we're relying on other people to absorb a lot of the cost to give it to us. And that makes it hard. And I think some of what we need to do is to think a little bit about what data sources can we get and what data sources can we have. And again, this is probably another talk in and of itself. What data sources can we create? Can we absorb the cost from to generate the data sources themselves, so that we're not relying on other people subsidizing our business?
Okay, the next one. Do you have a suggestion how ESPs can avoid to onboard senders which do sender hopping? Should ESPs collaborate on that?
I think ESPs kind of do collaborate on that. Certainly, there's the stuff that the CSA does and the meetings that they hold. There's MOG, there's the deliverability channel over on the Email Geek Slack. There are a lot of places where I think the collaboration is happening, and I also think that there are places where we're talking informally, and you're always welcome to come talk to me because I can do this all day. And this is kind of one of those interesting problems that I'm sure there's a solution there. And I think, if we started to think about it, and if we started to talk about it, and I tend to get distracted because I've got this client or that client, or, we're doing business stuff for whatever. But these are the kinds of things I think we need to start having more conversations about. And I'm not quite sure. And I've been thinking about maybe I need to host more of these conversations, or maybe somebody else can host more of these conversations. But this is we as an industry have to come together and talk about how do we do better. And we do pretty good. I mean, I'm not going to say that we don't do pretty good. We do pretty good, but I think we can do better, and I think we need to have that conversation a bit.
Okay, we have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Did you address the challenges of the ESP tools to an ISP, for example, Microsoft or Google? Are they interested? Do they care?
So,
interesting question.
I have been, it's probably been 15 years since I sat outside the Microsoft campus in a dive bar in Santa Clara, talking with the guy who actually created SNDS, and talking with him about how we could make it better. And I've certainly, talked to a lot of different Microsoft folks over the years. I think it's probably, I would be surprised if it's not common knowledge that I think SNDS is limited in its usefulness. And I have made that comment to different folks inside Microsoft. But again, they're just like, hey, it's free, take it, Gmail, I think, is, again, I think they're open to discussion. I know that the Google Postmaster tools was actually developed in fairly close collaboration with one of the big ESPs. And I've certainly had talks with some various folks inside there. But there is that piece of, again, these are tools that they're making available for us. And so it's expensive to maintain them. And I think, we're really lucky in that Google will backfill data, whereas Microsoft doesn't. And that, I think, is part of how the tools are set up. Microsoft, I don't think, saves any of the data. It's like it goes into the web interface, it goes into SNDS, and then we throw it away because we're not going to keep all that data. Whereas Google will backfill it if, it breaks. But I think there's interest there. It's just getting the people who manage the resources to actually commit to spending the money to be able to do that. Certainly the individuals are like, yes, you're right, it needs to be fixed. I don't have the money to fix it.
Okay, and then I think the last question for today. Do you expect filtering to get better once domain-based filtering keeps evolving?
I think filtering is going to continue to get better and better and better. I think it's going to be more challenging because we're not going to be able to, so filtering is getting pushed down to, we're getting to individual users, and we're getting to individual mailboxes. It's not like, so the tools that we have, the probe accounts that we have to be able to determine what is going on with deliverability, they're not as useful as they were 5, 6, 8 years ago. And I think it's harder to monitor that because we're going to have to monitor every email address individually to be able to determine what's going to the spam folder and what's not. But I think, the filters are getting really good, and they have their occasional, oh, wow, that was really broken. And that's part of the challenge with machine learning filters, is the machines can learn the wrong thing. I don't know if you've seen some of them. There's one from the medical space where they were trying to train a machine learning filter to identify melanomas. And what they actually ended up teaching the machine learning filter was that any picture of skin that had a ruler on it was a melanoma, because of the training that they were doing, they were training them with pictures taken from clinical stuff where they had proven it was a melanoma, and they all had rulers in them, and then they were training it on other skin lesions that didn't have rulers on them, and the machine learning filters learned the wrong thing. So, machine learning is complicated, and the filters that we're using for email, we have to regularly update the training that they're doing, because the spammers are regularly updating how they're trying to get through them. So it's hard, but I think they will keep getting better.
Okay, so yeah, I think we're on point.
Awesome.
So, yeah, thank you again, Laura, for taking the time today and share your experience from the last years. And thank you, attendees, for joining us today. As I mentioned, we have another webinar at the beginning of December with my colleagues Sebastian and Alexandra, and we will do a little CSA review of the year. And yeah, thank you again, and have a nice day too. And
Thank
hopefully
you.
see you soon and hear you soon. Thank you again, Laura.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.